All right. Hello and welcome to Popular Liberty. We are back today with the fourth installment of They Have Uncrowned Him by Marcel Lefebvre. It is May 3rd in the year 2022 of our Lord Jesus Christ. And we are ready to go. And I say, let's just go ahead and get right into it. Chapter 4. Does the law oppress liberty? Liberty consists in the fact that by the help of civil laws, we can live more easily according to the prescriptions of the eternal law, as Leo XIII. I could not give a better summary of the disasters produced by liberalism in every domain, such as they are exposed in the preceding chapter, than by quoting to you this passage from a pastoral letter of bishops dating from 100 years ago. But so very up to date a century later. At the present hour, liberalism is the chief error of the intellects and the dominant passion of our century. It fashions an infected atmosphere which envelops the political and religious world on all sides, which is a supreme peril for society and for the individual. As an enemy of the Catholic Church, as gratuitous as it is unjust and cruel, it heaps up in a bundle in the insane disorder all of the elements of destruction and of death in order to banish the church from the earth. It falsifies ideas, corrupts judgments, adulterates consciences, enervates characters, inflames passions, subjugates governments, stirs up the governed, and not content to put out, if that were possible, the torch of revelation, it moves forward unconsciously and boldly to extinguish the light of natural reason itself. Wow. This, and I understand he's writing this in 1985, and he's saying that this is from the 1800s. It's like, holy shit. I mean, particularly that part about subjugating governments. What is it we're seeing right now? With our government is the one going around the planet subjugating other governments, and they're writing this well over 150 years ago, basically. And I mean, that just boggles my mind that they were so ahead of time, in their predictions. And I mean, this is a pastoral letter of bishops that was from the late 1800s, and they're saying, and they're putting out that okay, what they're trying, since they can't get rid of revelation itself, since they can't get rid of facts themselves, they're going to get rid of reason itself, which is the means by which we make sense of those things. And we fast forward into our century, and it's this is all we see. Where it's no, it's I'm a man, and it's it's I'm a woman, and even though I have a penis, and it's pregnant people, not pregnant women,
birthing person.
Yeah, and it just boggles my mind how far ahead of everybody else the Catholic Church was in predicting stuff like this. And moving on, the liberal principle. Is it possible to discover among such chaos of disorders in an error so multiform the fundamental principle that explains it all? I have told you following Father Roussel, the liberal is a fanatic of independence. That is it. Let us attempt to state it precisely. Now, to rewind just a little bit, he was saying, hey, they're a fanatic of independence in the sense that they push it to the absurd degree. Things like transgenderism or something like that. It's
the fanatic is the operative word, or is part of the operative word, because and the fanatic for independence. So you can start with a jump, maybe you might immediately think of wars for independence, but also independence from, again, what you might consider to be a traditional obligation vis-a-vis the family. That would also be a big part of this as well. And I was before we started recording, as I was kind of just thinking about this, because I guess, I'll probably have this complaint throughout the whole thing, but maybe I'm wrong, but I think there's a slight mistake in using the word liberalism in this total sense. I don't think the diagnosis, and clearly we can manifest and map the behavior patterns that they're talking about specifically, again with the revolution of 1789 that they're going to talk into. But yeah, I just now, so like liberalism is a system versus liberalism is just something that happens. And again, but I think but that's where, again, if we're what they're talking about here, and when they identify the enemy, so to speak, it's the fanatic for the independence, and it's that impulse that says, no, I don't have to. I guess it's not even.
It's like, I don't have to do it your way. I can that they can adhere to either the true or the false, or to the good or the evil. Either way, either one is just good, and they have the right to do both. And it's like, no, that is not correct.
What is interesting in here, I want to just double check before we move on. This footnote number 2, I'm going to check just for the year on this. So translation outline from the Latin text, so it doesn't give a year. Oh wait, no. De Ecclesia Tome. I guess we'll have to look up when that was published. I wanted to look for the year on this next segment, because it almost verbatim really maps precisely onto a very strict libertarian definition of property rights and
I was
liberty.
thinking the same thing,
which I found very interesting.
You want to go ahead and read it?
Yeah. So let us attempt to state it precisely. Cardinal Bioy, whose theological treatises were the books I studied at the Gregorian University and at the French Seminary in Rome. So if he's a bishop in 1985, do you know when he was born?
He was born in the early
early
20th century. He was at Vatican II, so that was in the
so you figure if he's
like
in his
the 20s.
40s. So this text is at least from the late 1800s, early 1900s, which I think is again very interesting to note and worth reflecting upon as we go into it. Because we think of libertarianism as a modern American libertarianism.
You think of it as only being 70 years old. It's not. It's like all of the fundamental presuppositions that it has are, I think it's just the modern incarnation of libertarianism is, just a slightly better, more logically consistent version of what had existed for quite a long time.
Yeah. And I think, and as I've put it before, it's kind of the last compromise, if you will, for the post World War II democratic world order, right? Yeah. It's kind of like that last compromise between the chaotic left and really the rest of us, if you will. I think that's the best way of understanding modern libertarianism. So, so his luminous pages on the treatises of the church, he expresses as follows the basic principle of liberalism. Liberty is the fundamental possession of man, quite sacred and inviolable, which it is not at all permitted to harm by any coercion whatsoever. As a consequence, this freedom without limit must be the immovable stone on which all the elements of the relations among men will be organized, the immutable norm according to which all things will be judged from the point of view of the law. Consequently, and the law not in caps. Consequently, everything that in a society will have the principle of the inviolate individual liberty as a basis will be equitable, just, and good. All the rest will be iniquitous and wicked.
Iniquitous.
Thank you. I missed that I. Iniquitous and wicked.
Let's go ahead and stop right there. It's like there's a lot to be said right there.
Well, I think let's finish it because there's only a little bit. Okay. Because it connects to the French. So
okay, you got
iniquitous and wicked. That was the thought of the perpetrators of the revolution of 1789, a revolution whose bitter fruits the entire world still tastes. That is the whole object of the Declaration of the Rights of Man from the first line up to the last. For the ideologues, it was the necessary point of departure for the complete rebuilding of society in the political order, in the economic order, and above all, in the moral and religious order.
You're right. I'm glad we finished it because it reminded me of a point I made earlier in the week when I was reading this, that the American Revolution is just the French Revolution driving the speed limit. And look right here, because what he says is that, that was the thought of the perpetrators of the revolution of 1789, and that is the whole object of the Declaration of Rights of Men. What is that referring to? Is coming back to here that liberty is the fundamental possession of men, quite sacred and inviolable, which is not at all permitted to be harmed by any sort of coercion. You could put the word aggression in there, and that any society that is founded upon this principle of inviolate individual liberty will be as a basis will be equitable, just, and good. We think of that as only being 50, 60, 70 years old. Not at all. It goes out all the way back to the French Revolution, which is again why I say that the the American Revolution is the French Revolution driving the speed limit. Because as you said, this was libertarianism really is the last final compromise of the post-World War II order. With
trying to capture those the good parts, because you pointed it, because you said driving the speed limit. But see, again, there's that operative word, limit. Because we say here, this freedom without limit was behind the spirit of 1789, right? And so you might say that, I think if you were accurately looking at history, you would have to say that the American Revolution, whatever narrative you want to put on top of that, did have limits, right? Yes. It didn't do what the French Revolution did, right? It cast out the regulars and it put them on boats and sent them overseas. It didn't chop people's heads off it didn't wantonly chop people's heads off in the square. Yeah. And so, and I'm focused on the word limit for another reason, which is I've been putting out some more premium content where I'm trying to explore some of the more philosophical, foundational elements of what I'm entitling the practice of skepticism, which is to say, how do we properly orient our reason, right? And part of that, I think, requires the introduction of a limit. Therefore, tautologically speaking, any system of thought that doesn't recognize a limit is going to be, well, if you will, chaotic, or it will eventually, it won't.
Yeah, it's postmodernism. If there is no limit, it has to be postmodernism, or it will eventually be so. That's why you have to say something is objective, or else, or else you end up with, complete subjectivism. There's no way around that. Something, because that which limits the system is that which is objective. That cannot really be disputed. You can say maybe that's the first principle, but really it's got to be a lot more than that, because a lot of people disagree on first principles, and it's also which ones do you include. This is why the church has held forever that what you really need is to have your reason trained by faith, and just treat the church as that which is objective, because she is rooted in eternity. And so, being that she's rooted in eternity, she is objective because she is an immutable, unchanging truth, and therefore she can be relied upon as kind of a bulwark and foundation of the truth, as the Bible calls it.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example of what religion gives people, and how it helps people as well.
But you also see that, because liberalism wants liberation from this, it has to get rid of the church. It is necessarily atheist. And this is why that when you had the French Revolution, you had the church get looted and you get burned, and today it's I like how Matt Erickson says that libertarianism, it's not that libertarianism has an atheism problem, it is an atheism problem. Ditto liberalism. Liberalism is also an atheist problem, necessarily so, because this is the only way for them to have true liberation from an objective truth, to where they can say, I can adhere to truth or falsehood, whichever one I want, and it's my decision.
So personally, I mean, I've spent a lot of time studying the subjective nature of being, and what philosophers have had to say of that. And in particular, we're going to go before around the time of Socrates to Parmenides. And Parmenides is one of the people that Plato argues against in his postulation of the forms of these perfect representations, because Parmenides can be paraphrased as man being the measure of all things. But if you go back and you read this is something that's always stuck with me. So it's one of those things that I've if you go back and read Parmenides, one of the things that he puts out, and one of the longest pieces we have of his still intact, is this poem. And in this poem, a goddess comes to him on a chariot with led by horses, and she tells him that effectively that there is what is and there is what is not, and you cannot conceive of what is not. So you see, even in subjectivity, we have to. We can still resolve things into something, whether that is an objective truth of the church, or even if you just say again, well, there is what is, right? Because you literally can't perceive of nothing. Even the process of emptying your mind is an action of a kind, right? It's a train of it. If I can't, because to not perceive is to not be. Even that impulse can lead us very, very far, and we can still recognize things like law, tradition, and better ways of doing things. So again, you can see even if we stick in a subjectivist frame, these people don't win. These people don't win if you actually push the logic. So there's something else that really, I think, motivates the Robespierres and the people who fund and push for revolution without limits, independence without limits. And I think that's where we invariably fall into a conversation of power. But I wanted to belabor this point a little bit, because he's going to engage in some philosophy next, which I think is useful, and also demonstrates again the harmonious aspect of reason and faith.
Before you do that, just for the note for the listeners, that what he just mentioned of how this necessarily results in a power struggle, that was chapter 2. Go ahead. So he's about to engage in philosophy, and sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to get that point out there for
no. I had wrapped up my point. My point, I think, succinctly. But so there's you can still pull yourself out of the natural subjectivity of existence, right? And as a philosopher, I've spent a lot of time staying in that vein, precisely, I guess, for that point of saying, well, even in a postmodern frame, we can still find meaning, and we don't have to, cut off our genitals, as the case, or encourage children to cut off our genitals. But you will say, going back to the piece, is not liberty a characteristic of intelligent beings? As a consequence, is it not right that the basis of the social order is derived from it? Be careful, I will reply, of which liberty are you speaking? For this term has several meanings which the liberals strain their ingenuity to confuse. Therefore, we have to distinguish. So philosophy is a way of, I think, fundamentally, when done properly, is a process of neutralizing rhetoric, right? Because he points out that where do we hear conflation in rhetoric, and that the right is learning to wield this tool doesn't take away from the fact that it's rhetoric is imprecise. Yes. Yeah. But so where do we get this thing of we're going to conflate a bunch of things together to make our case better? Maybe in a thing under the rubric of women's health, as we're recording, given the topical news today, or the perennial issue of abortion in American politics. So we see that conflation as well. Again, I'm trying to draw corollaries to what people would perceive today as we try to talk about. So then what's the process that we have to do? Well, we have to distinguish. We have to do a little bit of legwork to distinguish the different ways in which we can use the word liberty, the paradox of identity, as I call it. Let us then do a little philosophy. The most elementary reflection shows us that there are 3 kinds of liberty. First, a psychological liberty, or free will, proper to beings provided with intelligence, which is the faculty of turning one's mind towards such or such a good independently of all interior necessity, reflex, instinct, etc. Free will constitutes the fundamental dignity of the human person, which is said to be sui juris, to depend on oneself, and therefore to be responsible, which an animal is not. Anything you want to chime in for that one?
I think I'm going to come back to it, but yeah,
Okay.
We'll come back to it.
Then we have moral liberty, which concerns the use of free will. So the use of free will. So psychological liberty is our free will. Moral liberty is the use of our free will. A good use if the means chosen lead to the obtaining of a good end. A bad use if they do not lead to that. You can see from this that moral liberty is essentially relative to the good. Pope Leo XIII defines it in a way that is magnificent but very simple. Moral liberty, he says, is, quote, the faculty of moving oneself in the good, end quote.
I like that right there. But, that's where I think this is the biggest, kind of confusion that I think the liberals make, is that, real liberty is necessarily moving oneself towards the good. You are adhering properly to the, to the true and to the good, because to adhere to the false is necessarily to make yourself less free. To adhere to the evil is necessarily to make yourself less free. And so that you are using your free will here, which in itself is immutable, because in your own mind, your psychological liberty, I mean, that's basic. That part is basically immutable, but moving outward from there, is necessarily where things start to get a little bit more mutable. And but in order to maintain your psychological liberty, you have to use it towards moral liberty. Otherwise, you end up, at the very end with physical liberty, where you don't have any. And I noticed this progression here where he said, and he makes this point too at the which we'll get to, that physical liberty is what liberals treat as immutable, when really it's absolutely not. And they, when in reality, they should be treating kind of psychological liberty as immutable. And, but it's funny because they also do the opposite here. Because what kind of liberty do they want to squelch the most? Psychological liberty. They want to take away your ability. It's like they literally have this thing completely reversed, because they've literally stood man on his head, to where the actual immutable liberty he has in his head, of his mind, is the part where they most want to change and they most want to coerce and aggress against. And you see all of the means that they have, from the media, academia, and all the way down to straight up threats of cancellation and stuff like that, of how they're trying to conform your, because you founded a civilization on bodily physical liberty, you necessarily leave open for the left, this psychological liberty right there, for them to take that from you by whatever means. And the fact that they can't means that this is a never ending struggle necessarily. And whereas if you were to found it the proper way, it's funny because both sides, they treat moral liberty as the bridge. So the second part of moral liberty is always the bridge. It's from one to the other. So moral liberty is the bridge from psychological liberty to physical liberty, but they treat physical liberty as the foundation, moral liberty as the bridge towards psychological liberty, which by which they mean taking yours.
Well, and again, let's go back to those limits we were talking about before in the American Revolution. What was the limit that, and to a popular conversation in today's politics, what was that first limit that they put, in the Bill of Rights? Well, there was a few: freedom of religion. Well, freedom of religion, but or not establishing a church, but also the freedom of speech. And so what I've always, and it's funny, it just clicked for me now as we were reading it, because I've written a few times about this, and I've said for years that the concept of freedom of speech, as it's enshrined in the Constitution, is a recognition of precisely what in this piece they call the psychological liberty. It's that free will that is, how is it put here? That is proper to beings provided with intelligence. So it is to say that for, I think the way I've talked about it is for free. It's that you don't get to control my mind. You can potentially control my body, right? You can limit me in a million different ways, but you can't silence my mind. And in the best possible interpretation of, or in the best sense of what some people were trying to do, let's say, with liberalization, you see that you have to recognize that. And now we've clearly moved beyond that. And so,
Yeah.
but one, and just as another point to add up, which is something that we've been hitting, is this concept existed before the revolution of 1789 or the revolution of 1777. In fact, you might say that the American Revolution was attempting, or did a better job of attempting to reassert this psychological liberty. They just didn't protect. They just didn't, I guess, maybe foresee the longevity or figure out ways to protect against invasion.
They knew it was a problem, and there's like, here's our best guess at how to solve it, and we just I don't think they had the right information. It's like they understood the problem, and this is why I say, hey, the Constitution was a really good first try.
Yeah,
and like a really, really good first try. It's like they clearly understood the problem, and they didn't understand how to fix it, though, because that's not self-evident from the nature of problems. Is that is such, or I should say that the nature of solutions is not that they're self-evident from the problems that they are, set to fix. And so the like when you have the founding fathers, I do give them, like, some of them, not the Masons. The Masons, I think, were up to no good. But
sure.
But I think there were a whole bunch of them in there that really were trying, and they were not the 1789 kind of liberals, because and you see this, like, hey, that
why? Because they were they were marginally aristocratic. They were people of means who were the ones waging it, which is to say they had more to lose.
Yeah.
So it's a different set of incentives in a situation like that, where you have a greater appreciation for what might be lost if everything goes away. Whereas, for the poor Frenchman of this time period, who was living in what today we would consider absolute squalor, what do they have to lose?
Nothing.
Right. Yeah. And that's again, when we see this time and time again in places like the Middle East. We see this going on between Russians and Ukrainians right now. Is people, when pushed to a point where they have nothing to lose, is never a pretty sight. And you see the worst elements of humankind, of humanity, or our more animalistic nature.
Because right there, what you're saying is not what you are necessarily saying. There is that. Right here, where he says, hey, the faculty of moving oneself towards the good is what moral liberty consists of. Because these people, that, like the Frenchies, had nothing to lose, what's their greatest good? Their own good. So therefore, what needs to be moved? It's like, they are the greatest good. They don't need to move. You are the one who needs to move by force towards me. Your psychological liberty must be forced to conform to me, the greatest good, and to my greatest good. That's the essence of the French Revolution that has been played out in the American Revolution 200 years later. And let's go ahead and keep moving forward.
Moral liberty is not therefore an absolute. It is all relative to the good. That is to say, finally, to the law. For it is the law, and firstly the eternal law, which is in the divine intelligence, then the natural law, which is the participation in the eternal law by the rational creature. It is this law which determines the order put in by the Creator between his ends that he assigns to man, to survive, to multiply, to organize in society, to arrive at his last end, in the summum bonum, which is God, and the means suitable for obtaining these ends. The law is not an antagonist of liberty. On the contrary, it is a necessary help. And that must be said also of the civil laws worthy of that name. Without the law, liberty degenerates into license, which is doing what pleases me. Certain liberals, making an absolute of this moral liberty, precisely advocate license, the freedom indifferently to do good or evil, to adhere indifferently to the true or the false. Who cannot see that the possibility of falling short of the good, far from being the essence and the perfection of liberty, is the mark of fallen man's imperfection? Moreover, as St. Thomas explains, the power of sinning is not a liberty but a servitude. He who commits sin is a slave of sin.
And I want to, harp on this point just a little bit, because this is the point that I just want to keep making throughout the whole thing. And I know you know about what I'm about to say, but like that, this idea of, hey, laws that are good, but I should say right here, the natural law is a participation in the eternal law. In other words, it's founded upon it. The natural law is not founded upon the self. It is not founded upon man's nature. It is founded upon man's nature as he received it from God, which is the eternal law. And so this, we are necessarily presupposing that, we got our nature from God, and that we are, to follow our nature, which came from him. And so when you are saying, when I'm making laws to achieve this end, civil laws, these are human man-made laws, which is ironically not these are the laws that liberals do not object to, not really, because as long as they're the ones who make them and they're the ones who are enforcing them on you. And so, when you have these kinds of, like these human laws, they need to be reflective of the natural law, which we did not create, but human laws we can create, and which is why liberals don't object to them. So, but, for them to be good, and they have to be, for human laws to be good, they have to lead you to this final end, to this summum bonum, because that is where real liberty is found, because you are necessarily adhering to the greatest truth. Like what he's saying right here, the license is the freedom to indifferently to do good or evil, to adhere indifferently to true or false. And this is and this is necessarily going to fall short of liberty, because we are designed in a certain way. And like you can say, hey, I'm free to fill my gas tank with with salt and vinegar. And like, okay, yeah, but now you've necessarily lost freedom of movement that your car was giving you. And so it's like, even like in a car engine, it's like, this is designed to work a certain way, and you don't fill it with the gas tank with like salt and vinegar. You fill it with gasoline, because that's what it's meant to run on. But what liberals do is they say, okay, yes, I have an immutable human nature which does not change, and yes, and no, there is no such, but because there's no such thing as eternal law or God, or necessary, and for them necessarily so, because of there's no such thing as that, my human nature, which can easily be changed, even though it's never works, and even though the human machine is designed to run in certain ways and to take certain inputs in certain quantities and no further and no less, they say, nah, yeah, we're gonna throw out the instruction manual, going to throw out the user manual, and I'm just going to press buttons. And nobody else does that. It does that besides the liberal.
There's two trends within that, because you have like the Epicurean materialist atheistic answer of the ancients, you might say, which is the maximization of pleasure, right, in the current life. But you have but that's still
false.
But hang on, but that still recognizes a nature. The modern liberal and then progressive were people who are rejecting the concept of man having a nature. This is where I think the social Darwinists of the early 20th century do a disservice to they do a disservice to the field of like biology, because in fact like modern evolutionary theory would agree completely with what God assigns to man, right? To survive, to multiply, to organize society, to arrive at his last end, summum bonum, which is God. And summum bonum is, I think, the ultimate prize, right?
Ultimate good.
Ultimate, yeah. So the other point I wanted to hit was crap. Hang on, it'll come back to me. I just had it. Oh, is this? So we even have, again, if we're going to analogize libertarianism as like the last attempt at a compromise. What is that compromise? Aggression, right? Okay, we've managed to define it. What did the people who don't believe in limits do almost immediately? And we see it time and time again. Well, what constitutes aggression? And can I twist, because at that point I'm only interested in my power, when I twist the concept of aggression to suit my needs? So we see again even the same pattern playing out, because you could even say a non-aggressive behavior is by definition moral liberty, right? You could make that claim. I think if you, right, but then really what you end up turning it into is the license, because it's, I want to do things that I don't, that I wouldn't have to, that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise, or doing what pleases me.
Yeah, and you know, like what they're saying, you know, it's not the because they make physical liberty an absolute. What they necessarily lose is that you can act in ways, you know, that cause that by yourself that cause you to lose less liberty, and that a coercion against you that is pointing you back towards your eternal, towards the highest good, towards that summum bonum, you know, is necessarily not against your liberty. It is in favor of your liberty, because it is getting you to do what you should have been doing, you know, that would have made you free.
The existentialists of the early 20th century, this was the point that got lost in when I was talking. So the early existentialists were grappling with the modernistic age, or if you will, after Nietzsche proclaims the death of God, right? Which is removed. This is before postmodernism. And what the existentialists said, or at least Sartre, who's one of like the most popular ones, talks about, is how that every tool, everything created, has a purpose, right? And there's a purpose for its creation. But given that but given the atheistic premise that human beings have no creator, it is then left up to interpretation what our purpose is. And that is, I mean, and again, if you want to talk about an idea that when you're talking second, third, fourth order magnitude effects, right? So it's not necessarily about, if you think of like a billiards game, it's not about the first hit, right? The second, third, or fourth is how you might be able to hit 2 or 3 balls to knock the one in that you want to have happen. When we're talking on second, third, and fourth order of magnitudes, when you introduce that idea into a population, right, that you have no fundamental purpose. Not even, by the way, not even the basic biological purpose of perpetuation of the species, pair bonding, or because people aren't even saying, you know, you could point out single motherhood as being like is just like an R selected strategy. So like, forget the K selection strategy, right? If you can even say R selection, which is about continuing the race, but actively right now the massive the ideology is about sterilizing people in whatever way they can. And you see, and when you look for that, when your pattern recognition is turned on to this, start paying attention, if you don't already, people listening, and look for those patterns that have to deal with not being, again, going against these basic things to survive, right? To live for tomorrow, to multiply.
It is necessary, because liberalism is necessarily full of acts against what one's nature. They are necessarily less able to advance that nature, ending with less reproduction. And I want to also point out that their big thing is coercion, which is it's subtle, but that's not the same as aggression. It's actually a broader term. And again, libertarianism is the final compromise. And so
it's a refinement of an idea.
And so what's going, and this is where when I think the solution to libertarianism is that that actually a lot of coercion is actually very good, particularly the coercion that is built into as the foundation of private property. Because
how about the coercion that exists at the third and fourth order of magnitude? So it's not even necessarily anything you feel. It's just the thing of saying like, well, I have to have some kind of a job, right? There's an anti-work movement out there. Where does that idea come from? That idea comes from not putting a limit on your existence, right? Exactly. Understanding that no, there are things that have to happen in order for you to do well.
In order for you to even continue existing. And so what actually needs to be done as the solution to this is the solution to license, or to libertinism, is that you have to say, okay, the purpose, the telos of property is to point people again back towards their eternal end. towards that summum bonum. So you as a property owner, as a as a requirement of being an owner, because remember, ownership is different than possession. Possession merely just means I have control of it, whereas ownership is a moral component. It has a moral component to it, and you have to ask, okay, so it's moral control. Well, what makes it moral? Well, the thing that makes it moral is that you are acting in accordance with your using it towards its eternal end, towards your eternal end as the property owner. Because if your property ownership descends from your self ownership, which we're going to use that term for now, but it's not really a good one. But because you have an eternal end, therefore that has to get transferred now to your property, which is an extension of yourself. And so if you are a property owner, and let's say you own a big corporation that owns a lot of territory, you have an obligation now to use that ownership towards towards the eternal end of yourself and everybody living in the property. So yes, you have an obligation to use that coercive ability that is the basis of your private property, for everybody, for all of your subjects, final ends toward God. You need to be instantiating the Catholic Church, or really it's the Catholic Church, but at least Christianity, which points people towards their final end. Or at least is an attempt to point people towards their final end of God. And this is this is what makes ownership moral, in this particular framework here. And that the liberal denies this, and they try to make this the start, necessarily ends with your biological reality getting completely constrained, and the ultimate constraint of which is death. 40% rate.
Well, and also to the point is, under Darwinian conditions, right? Most of the modern things that we see, right? There's a reason why the queerness and the critical theory exists in Western highly individualized cultures, and why you don't see that played out to the same level in a country like India, or in a country like Pakistan that is relatively poorer than that of the United States. So I think, there's definitely more to explore there, but let's continue. On the contrary, guided well by the law, channeled between its priceless guardrails, liberty attains its end. Here is what Pope Leo XIII sets forth in this regard. The condition of human liberty being such, it needed a protection. It needed helps and aids capable of directing all its movements towards the good and turning them away from evil. Without that, liberty would have been for man a very harmful thing. Firstly, a law that is to say, a rule of what must be done or not done was necessary for it. Leo XIII concludes his explanation with this admirable definition, which I will call plenary, of liberty. In a society of men, liberty worthy of the name does not consist in doing everything that pleases us. That would be in the state an extreme confusion, a disorder that would result in oppression. Liberty consists in this, that with the help of the civil laws, we can live more easily according to the prescriptions of the eternal law. Finally, there comes physical liberty, or liberty of action, or liberty vis-a-vis constraint, which is the absence of external constraint that impedes us from acting according to our conscience. Well, it is precisely this liberty that the liberals make into an absolute, and it is this conception that we are going to have to analyze and criticize. And I think here we have very clearly the beginnings of what we call today leftism.
Yes, this is
because again, just is to reading this is such a foreign. It's always been a foreign concept to me, of saying anybody can I used to ask people is man free? Does man deserve to be free? And should man be free? This is like, you know, like early in my academic thing. These are the fun philosophical questions I like to ask my friends. And almost invariably, and this is where I started to get the idea of limit at this early stage, and like the idea of a philosophy of incentive. Immediately, the person's mind would say, well, yeah, I guess I'm free to punch you in the face. Or they would say, like, well, am I just free to punch you in the face? You know, and it's like, so
that's where it goes every time.
And that's where it goes. Well, and yeah, this connects to obviously a bunch of other stuff, but
that's that liberal conception right there, right in front.
Mm-hmm. That's how people think of it, almost invariably, almost immediately.
They think of it immediately as the physical liberty.
Yeah, but also the idea of like using that liberty to like do you harm or do me harm. Which incidentally traces a little bit to what Leo the 13th is talking about here, where he says it needs a little bit of guide and it needs a little bit of a little bit of massaging, and
it needs to be pointed in the eternal direction. And it's funny because, like, again, I was just making this point earlier that because they make the physical liberty right here the foundation, necessarily they must move inward, and so you get to moral liberty is pointed towards myself, which is my psychological liberty. My psychological liberty then therefore becomes the ultimate good. And now that you are not in behavior in accordance with that, with that ultimate good of myself, of my psychological liberty, now you've violated my psychological liberty. And this is where you get the idea that, so again, you might say, oh no, telling a trans person that they are their biological gender is a microaggression. Bingo. Right there. And it's because they have managed to turn man upside down on his head, where his head is on the outside.
I was going to say, it's about the pretty little picture. It's about the optics, right? It's about how do you have the purpose. It's that NPR says that they talk to a nationally representative sample of parents and that there's no problem. This was a recent headline. And of course, the study was only of 1,000 people, right? Yeah. And like, that's, okay, so 1,000 parents, that's 500 kids. That's not even and I know, 1,000 kids, but 500 kids, that's a very small school. Yeah. Most public schools are in the magnitude of, thousands of students. So it's again that, but we have the picture of the physical liberty, of the physical representation and like showing of this thing. Anyway.
Go ahead. I'm going to fix it. It needs to go in a little more.
Natural order and natural law. Before this, I want to insist on the existence of the natural order and of the natural law, because the liberals will consent to admitting laws, but laws which man himself has forged, since they reject all order out of ordination or ordinance, and all law of which man would not be the author. Now that there is a natural order conceived by the Creator for mineral, vegetable, and animal nature, and equally for human nature, this is a scientific truth.
Science is racist.
And that's where we are, right?
Boy, you get this one wrong. Boy, go ahead and read it. No scholar would dream of denying the existence of laws written into the nature of things and men. No way.
What does scientific research indeed consist in, for which billions are spent? What is it, if not for the quest of laws? People speak often of scientific inventions, but this is an error. Nothing has been invented. Something has only been discovered and exploited them.
It's funny, for the guy who really just nailed it in the previous section about how liberalism has basically turned man inside out, where his immutable liberty is actually on the outside and his immutable liberty is on the inside. It's on the inside. I should say his immutable. Yeah, it's basically they reverse the physical liberty with the psychological liberty. His psychological liberty is on the outside. His physical liberty is somehow on the inside. And what they've completely turned him inside out, to where he has to use force against everything else, to make it conform to himself. Now he's like, no one would dream of denying the existence of laws written into human nature. Oh boy, did you underestimate liberals? And right there, he should have seen it. But like, but it's like, I can't blame him at all. It's like no one would think, oh God, you couldn't possibly deny the obvious scientific truths.
Well,
watch me hold my beer, or really
part,
hold my bullshit.
Well, and in part, I think, and largely in part because he was still living in a world in which the Marxists hadn't moved on.
Yeah.
Right. So they were trying. So they were trying to break down the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. They still believed in the communist revolution, and I think, and this is like the Berlin Wall had not yet fallen, right? As far as I understand from when he had written this. So I think there's and it's worth belaboring that point, because we get caught up today. It's so easy for us to point at the university as a source for all of our ills. And while the beginnings of it were certainly existed during the time of his writing, they really didn't manifest, and they really didn't start to take power until the 90s. And this has been traceable of like what today we call wokeness or queer theory or critical theory. Like, it has its early roots in Marxist theory, but really it doesn't take on this new focus against breaking down the barriers of like between men and women, and then simultaneously the insistence upon a race essentialist narrative, right? But it is funny how he didn't have the conception of the cathedral. He didn't quite understand what mass media was going to be able to do. But I think in his defense, he would say, well, those people aren't scholars, no matter what you call them.
Those race hustlers and those gender professors or whatever, they're not real scholars. And it's like, he would agree with James Lindsay there, essentially. All right, go ahead. What is it if not the quest for laws? People speak often of scientific inventions, but this is an error. Nothing has been invented. Someone has only discovered laws and exploited them. These laws which are discovered, these constant relationships between things, are not created by the scholars. It is the same thing with the laws of medicine that govern health, the laws of psychology that rule the fully human act. These laws, everyone is agreed, man does not make them. He finds them already planted in human nature. Now, from the moment that, when it is a question of finding the moral laws that regulate human acts in connection with the great finalities of man, the liberals then speak only of pluralism, of creativity, of spontaneity, and of liberty. According to them, every person, or every philosophical school has the power to construct, its own proper ethics, as if man, in the rational and voluntary part of its nature, were not a creature of God.
Hang on, let's pause there. Has the power to construct its own proper ethics,
mentally construct on the outside.
But this is very right. This is very much akin to liberalism. This is very much today what we consider to be ideology, and in part why I think I've always had an issue with the field of ethics. Like even in studying it, like of course
this is the foundation.
I think I'm generally an ethical person, but there's always this like lingering thing of like, well, if we have morality, then why do we need ethics? You understand? And so right, and how can ethics point to different moralities?
How can they be disjointed?
Right.
How can libertarians say that, it's wrong to aggress against other people, and it's wrong to tell lies, but you totally have a right to tell lies? It's like, this is so obviously a contradiction. Because you can't say, oh, it's immoral to cheat on your wife, but you totally have the right to. It's like, which is it? Is it immoral, or and you don't have a right to it?
Yeah, you have the choice. You don't have the right.
Yeah, you have a choice, but it's not a right. And so where they're making this error here is they just assume that morality and ethics are these disjointed fields, and morality is kind of whatever you want, and really just reduces to morality is your opinion and ethics is my rule. And this is a critical error that is foundational to libertarianism, which must be rejected.
Well, and I think, again, to the point of how quickly the things have shifted, and the degree to which these mind pathogens of like the modern woke mind pathogen, chaotic left, whatever word we're going to use, has taken a hold of people. Is like, you know, like I love the Next Generation of Star Trek, right? And it's and like Gene Roddenberry was very much a utopist and borderline communist, but you know, he produced some good stuff. Even in that, mind you, even in Star Trek, they make the point multiple times about how men and women are like a dimorphic species, right? And in fact, in the course of their adventures, they meet species who are like asexual, or they meet species who have like who require like 3 people in order to procreate, and like they try to explore this thing. But it's always very established that human beings are male and female, and that they, you know, and that and this that. So just again, how far, like how all of a sudden we fell off the freaking cliff. It's worth, again, I think it's really worth remembering that, because we have to keep things in minds of the herd and understand that most people are just reflecting and reacting. They are not they're not in the same sort of conscious they're not in the same way consciously processing the information the way somebody at the top necessarily has to. The same way a CEO is making much different decisions than the line worker on a day-to-day basis. It's a different calculation depending on your perspective, going back to that subjectivity of existence, which has to be resolvable through some ultimate objective thing, which is the whole point of a natural law and eternal law above the law of man.
As like, and how can they say that, you know, basically this right here, okay, there's this universal ethic of pluralism, you know, but at the same time, I'm allowed to create my own ethics. It's like, well, wait, which is it? Is there no,
hang on, because it's that I get to create my own ethics and yours is wrong. It's not,
because that's where it necessarily leads.
And yours is wrong. Yeah.
It's like everyone can create their own, but but you have to follow mine. It's like, that's, you know, it's like, okay, so this is not really, this is obviously false. And this is everybody. Of course,
everybody can do what they want, man. Yeah, everybody can do what they want, man. But you know, if you don't put a rainbow flag up in June, like, you know, you're going to get run out of business. And that's just the free market.
And
that's not what's happening.
Of course, I mean, it's like right here. It's like there is this the like pluralism itself is like a contradiction in terms. It cannot possibly be true, because it really presumes its own falseness. Because okay, if everyone can create their own ethics, you know, but this ethic, but their ethic of their ethics cannot conflict.
Pluralism without limit.
Yeah,
you see, because pluralism can exist, right? There have been great cities of man where people of multiple faiths have walked, and business and commerce is done, and like the spice trade, and like the beginnings of what today we call but that's a pluralism with a limit. Why? Because it's because that polity is governed by a single moral and ethical structure. Right. So if you are, let's say you're in one of the great Muslim cities of old, as a Christian, you understand that you're in a Muslim city, right? And you have to, and like, you don't have the benefit of saying, well, I'm going to be subject to Christian law. You understand? And same too for the Muslim who found himself in one of the great Christian cities of old as well. Right. And so so you can see even a pluralism with a limit, and that limit eventually comes at that higher order magnitude when you're talking about populations at scale. What are the binding ideas that we use to formulate our laws?
Has to be dominant,
and our practices and our cultures.
Yeah, one of them necessarily has to be dominant in order for others to even begin to be tolerated. Because if one of them is not dominant, they can't possibly coexist.
Yes. Yeah. Precisely. And I think this is also where it gets so confused between. This is where, again, like as you're kind of like leading up to the cliff, because I think for people like you and me, we automatically, or at least I'll speak for myself, like I just say, oh, of course, again, going back to this thing where I realized everything has to have a limit, philosophically speaking, like, oh yeah, of course, multiculturalism doesn't mean that any culture can do whatever it wants. Right. It's like, well, clearly there has to be a limit. And like, so why are we having this horrible rhetorical political conversation around it? And that's why you got to keep digging until you get to the point to realize it's actually not about any of these things. Right. Like the modern racial narrative has nothing to do with fixing the wrongs of slavery, and everything to do with, again, as I always put it, social control. It has to do with controlling the population
Mhm.
far more than it has to do with transmitting any sort of truth, which is to say it's not in accordance with any sort of eternal law.
Yes. Go ahead.
He has then the human soul, right?
Has then the human soul.
Human soul. Yeah. Has then the human soul made itself, or does it make itself? This is the existentialist question, by the way. Yet it is, and there were Christian existentialists. yet it is obvious that, in spite of all their complexity and all their diversities, souls are tailored on the same model and have the same nature. Whether it is the soul of a Zulu of South Africa or of a Maori of New Zealand, whether you are talking about a St. Thomas Aquinas or of a Lenin, you are always dealing with the human soul. Now, a comparison will help you understand what I want to say. Nowadays, one does not buy a rather complicated device such as a washing machine, a copy machine, a computer, without asking how to operate it. There is always a law to use, a rule that explains the proper use of this object in order to succeed in making it do its work correctly to make it arrive at its end. I would say this rule was made by him who devised the machine in question, not by the housewife who would consider herself free to play with all the keys and all the buttons. So that's a little bit of a dig there, man.
Yeah.
That's a very 1960s man.
Yeah, and you could we could really hear, it's like this is the one time you will really hear his like his age come into play, because I mean at this point he would be in his late 60s, early 70s, and anyway, but like right there, like does it make itself or does it exist? No, it's clearly made by someone else. And so like do you have self-ownership? No, you can't possibly. You did not make yourself. You didn't.
Right.
and
so he's actually putting forth the existentialist formulation that I was talking about before, if you caught that. Right, is that he's actually addressing the exit. This would be like the Christian response to the existentialist question.
Which, part. By the way, this is the rebuttal to like the foundation of liberalism, because again, liberalism absolutizes physical liberty and makes that the immutable part, which is totally a lie, and then makes the psychological liberty the one that is is so very easily aggressed against. This is why you have the ideas like wrong think that you can get punched in the face for as a Nazi. So which is funny because they have it literally the opposite, that my physical liberty is absolute and cannot be touched. Yours, on the other hand, not so much.
So all proportions being preserved, there is a similar relation between our soul and the good Lord. God gives us a soul. He creates it. Thus, necessarily, he gives us laws. He gives us the means to make use of them to arrive at our ends, and above all, at our ultimate ends, which is God himself, known and loved in eternal life. So you see, this is giving us again that there is a high, like the highest purpose, our highest calling. Oh, we do not want that, the liberals cry out. It is man who should create the laws of the human soul. Let us not then be surprised that they make of man something out of balance, by means of making him live contrarily to the laws of his nature. Imagine some trees that would withdraw from the laws of vegetation. Well, they would die, that is clear. Trees that would stop giving their sap, or indeed birds that would refuse to look for their food because that contingency did not please them, well, they would perish. Not to follow their law, which their natural instinct dictates to them, is death. Notice here that man does not follow a blind instinct like the animals. God has given us this immense gift of reason so that we may have understanding of the law that rules us, in order that we direct ourselves freely towards the end, but not without applying the law. The eternal law and the natural law, the supernatural law, and also the other laws which derive from the first ones, the human laws, civil or ecclesiastical, and all these laws are for our good. Our happiness is in them. Without an order preconceived by God, without laws, liberty would be for man a poisoned gift. Such is the realistic conception of man, which the church defends as much as it can against the liberals. It was in particular the honor of the great Pope Pius II, the 12th, to have been the champion of the natural and Christian order in the face of the attacks of contemporary liberalism. To come back from that to speaking of liberty, let us say briefly that liberty cannot be understood without law. These are two realities strictly correlative, which it would be absurd to separate and contrast. It is absolutely in the eternal law of God that we must search for the rule of liberty, not only for individuals, but also for human societies.
Right
Again,
there.
yeah. No,
right.
sorry. That's where I have that moment of like, man, it's just that reminder of it's just a wave on the shore, man. Like when it comes to thought and figuring these things out, it's just a wave on the shore.
Yeah.
And like the unique ways in which like the individual sand grains differ is what we can study. But like, I mean, again, just literally like what did I say of like some of the stuff I'm putting out there? I've never read Bishop Lefebvre before reading this. And you know, again, they're just the correlations and the way things can come out at the same time is freaking, it's annoying sometimes, you know?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it really strikes me that if you have, reason which is trained by the church, everything works out really, really well. And and to me, it's like, okay, but you could not have gotten to like the church by pure reason. It's like it only works in one direction. It's like because it seems like the church really is stumbled onto something truly eternal and objective, to which, and when it communicates this to us and we understand it and behave by it, and I say and behave in accordance with it, everything works really well. And it's like that, it's like the revelation, like we almost couldn't know our own nature, without the church telling us this was our nature, which it itself couldn't figure out except by revelation, by being told it by someone else telling it. And so when you have stuff like right here with the liberals who deny all of that and their reason is completely untrained, what do? They try all these things which don't work. And there's one way to get it right and a million ways to get it wrong. And liberals have tried all 1 million of them. And to the point where, okay, what happens when the bird decides it doesn't want to look for food, or that the plants want to, get away from sunlight? They die. What happens when, man tries to get away from like his biological instincts, which he should obviously know better, like, that he should be trying to reproduce. He should be trying to be a better self for that end. And, and that he should be accepting of who he is, and how he's made. What happens? He dies. It's like he cannot reproduce, and he probably will end up killing himself. It's like, I mean, it's a horrible, miserable way to live, to adhere to, something that is truly false or truly evil is necessarily to be less free, and to make yourself that much closer to death and your eternal end, and I should say an eternal death. And and so, it really is clear then that, that laws enforced with force, like this is a good thing so long as the force itself is points you towards your eternal end. And to say that this is an aggression, that this is necessarily taking away from my liberty, is necessarily false. Like, no, not only is it not taking away from your liberty, it's actually adding to it, because that you've been a force that has been applied to you in that direction of eternity. And so so like this like core principle of liberalism right here, of the absolute nature of physical liberty, must necessarily be completely false.
Nowadays, one does not buy a rather complicated device without asking how to operate it. And it's interesting that he's talking about this in relation to a human soul. And so what does, and I think, and he says, comparing a Thomas Aquinas and a Lenin, they both have that. And I think what you see is, what you see in the latter case certainly is what a man can do when he thinks his soul is of his own choosing and making. Yeah. And that's really part of the Well, that's really a key, isn't it, to understand like the true depravity at the bottom of this. It's
There is no bottom, unless you want to count Lindsey Graham.
Sure.
I'm kidding.
But it's but the other thing that was struck in this, and I think we're starting to see kind of we're starting to see the backlash to this finally. But our whole lives we've been fed this ridiculous narrative about the separation between like the church and science, and that the church has been like the new atheist church is the enemy of science sort of thing. And there's certainly there's a conservatism and a like reluctance to new ideas in any ancient institution, right? Anything that would challenge its order and power. But again, to the point, here is the bishop citing science. And what do we see today? We see the conservative, evangelical American right partnering with all of these heterodox, liberal, moderate left-wingers. Why? Over what? Over science. Why? Because good science invariably uncovers the natural order of things, and because that's its purpose. And so, like, and just to the point is, and so we see again just how out of really how out of whack are like the larger sense making apparatus of like American and Western society is today. It is truly something that
it has to be tuned. Like your sense making, it's like a radio. It has to be tuned into the proper frequency.
Precisely.
And if it's out of tune, it's not going to work. And the proper frequency it should be tuned into is God, which is an eternal truth, an immutable, permanent truth, which is communicated through the church. It's like you have to let the church put its hands on your radio dial of your sense making apparatus and tune it into the right frequency, and you have to let that happen.
Well, and I think one of the big problems that we see then is so why isn't the church where it should be in that regard? You understand? I think that's where some people are listening, and certainly I'm thinking as we're having this conversation is like,
I can tell you right now.
So where is it?
It's the separation of church and state, because it's like the church.
That's a bold claim.
Well, yeah. Because the church should be tuning. Basically, the way God always works is He always works through intermediaries. It's like He's it's not that He's left us all alone to fend for ourselves. It's that He's given us real intermediaries who help us with these things, so that He doesn't have to. Because the reason He can say that He's given us everything we need is because He has. And so these intermediaries He's given is one, the church, and two, the state. The state is here to make laws, and they don't know which laws they need to make by themselves. They have to receive that information from the church. So the hierarchy is necessarily God, who gives that truth to the church, who then transfers that truth to the state, who then makes laws that help guide and transfer that truth to the people. And by doing it this way, you necessarily you wind up like with something that kind of looks like feudalism, where hey, this is what built Western civilization. It worked. Christian feudalism worked, and because it had everybody in their natural place in the natural hierarchy. With God at the foundation of it.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, we can parse out feudalism and kind of, because I think you can even point out that the modern division of labor, you still kind of have the same form, right? So again, it's really just that second order effect, because like the reality is there one way or the other. It's just a matter of like, what's the perception put on top of it? Okay, well, what's that Marxist perception? That Marxist perception is that your boss is actually stealing from you. Like there's not a symbiosis. There's not an actual, to your point, kind of a connection of the Trinity, where all people, like there's the feedback from the top to the bottom, right? What we really see today in the modern age is that separation between the different groups. That's one of the reasons why we see this we see this very clearly in media, because there's no harmony up the top and the bottom, especially as it relates to like 50% of the entire country, right? as basically as it goes, right? As we find ourselves on that side. There was one point I wanted to make, or a question I wanted to ask. What you were talking about that God gives us the rules. Oh, the church and the state. I'll even go, because it's not even, because we can start, okay, church and state, but it's also that maximalism thing. And what's that maximalism turned into, right? What is that without limit turned into in the modern age? Is the church doesn't get to talk politics.
Yeah.
Because it's their 30 pieces of silver. It is literally the same betrayal of the apostle, of the apostle to the Savior, because it's about their tax exempt status.
That's
the president of the United States. Again, as a Catholic, I struggle with going back to church. I think that's why this is something anyway. But I've never supported abortion in my life, and I never would, right? You can maybe you can understand, you can empathize with people, but that doesn't make it right. Again, it's about what is right. It's not about what is quick or expedient. You have the president of the United States today. I just tweeted this out, and I, kind of on a lark, I just said USCCB, the United States Catholic Council of Bishops. Do you have a comment? Because here, I just want to pull this up real quick if it'll load.
It's they will not say anything about it,
and they're not going to say anything about it. But you have, but to the point of here, the President Joe Biden told reporters during Tuesday that the question of where life begins is unknown.
Wow.
Which isn't even true. Not biologically speaking, not scientifically speaking, but forget that. This is President Joe Biden, who claims to be a Catholic. You understand? This is a guy who touts his Catholic faith whenever it's deemed convenient. And there's no comment from the bishops. Now the bishops have their own problems, what with their covering up of pedophilia and and stuff like that, which is awful. But to the point, that's where I always find I need to ask that question at the end of these things, because I feel as though if the broader hierarchy or institution of the church was, I guess, doing, acting like this, you really see that again, showing that the idea of liberty is compatible with a Catholic perspective. And of course it is, right? But really doing that work of demonstrating it, and not just simply bowing to the progressive orthodoxy. But again, that's the 30 pieces of silver.
Yeah, it's that. That's the first time that hit me, is that it really is the same betrayal, and it's this that separation right there. It wasn't done. It was done by force, but it's been perpetuated in the modern age through bribery. It's just, man.
Yeah, it might have been Judas's fate, but it was still, in the moment, it was still the money that did it, right?
Yeah.
And for what? And for what?
And he died. He got away from it.
And for what? For all of the churches to shut down at the government's behest and remove, and telling everybody that your faith, and this is that your faith doesn't actually matter.
Yeah, it's obey the lockdown. And they couldn't say anything about it. It's God, and they end up just doing it to themselves, basically.
Yeah.
Wow, that is profound, man. All right, I think that's it for tonight. Any final comments? We're going to end on that.
Go to beenawake.com, subscribe with your email address, and I've been putting out a lot more premium content. Podcast will be back soon.
Y'all do that. And if you want to continue this discussion with me, that you can join my subscribestar.com, my Discord server at subscribestar.com/popular-liberty, and continue this conversation here. Wow, man, that was profound. Take care. Night, guys.